Hi there, I'm Jonathan Larson. I am an extension entomologist with the University of Kentucky Department of Entomology. I was invited to share some information with you as part of this series about some of the different pest scouting management methods you might use for tomatoes in particular, but then also some of the strategies that may help you with some of our more difficult to control pests or some of the more common ones that we see kind of out there in the high tunnels. It is important to note that high tunnels present a really ideal growing situation, not only for plants, but for a lot of different pests. You will see some people talking about sort of a honeymoon period when they first begin working in a high tunnel, where they talk about not seeing a lot of pests. But then eventually the pests will find that high tunnel and they are able to take advantage of the relatively consistent humidity and temperature in there as well, and use that to also escape some of the natural enemies that control them in the field. So you end up with this kind of weird hybrid mixture of greenhouse pests and then also kind of classical field pests that might grow on a tomato. So when we talk about those kinds of pests, one of the first ones that we see usually in a high tunnel is the fungus gnat group. Fungus gnats are an interesting little group of critters. They are things that typically thrive in sort of wet, damp conditions out in the soil, in people's yards, and in other landscapes. In terms of when they get into agriculture, they're usually an issue for container production as well as semi-protected areas such as high tunnels and greenhouses. They can get into the soil, into the growing media that is used there, and then their larvae are able to take advantage of that situation and consume things and then mature and become adults eventually. You're seeing some of the different fungus gnat adults that you may encounter here in these two images. Generally speaking, we say they kind of look like mosquitoes. So they have kind of long, skinny legs. They are flies, so they only have two wings. If you notice that in the image on the right, we have the wings folded out. Flies are part of Diptera, so they only have two true wings. The back wings have been reduced to a different organ. In terms of other sort of interesting characteristics with the fungus gnats, many of them have kind of pointy abdomens. If you look at the rear end there, it kind of terminates in this pointy area. And then they have vaguely beaded antennae. Their wings are sort of also kind of vaguely blank. There's not a lot of venation there. You can see it looks mostly like a sort of membrane with just a few sort of stripes and lines in it. They're not a very noticeable organism unless there's lots of them, and then you will see them kind of hovering slowly in the air and landing in different places. The maggot stage is the stage that we tend to be more concerned with the fungus gnats. They are something that feeds in the root zone area. If they run out of their typical food, which is just fungus stuff that's kind of growing down in soil or in potting media, they will resort to feeding on seedlings. Excuse me, particularly by feeding on the root zone area. In the image on the right, you can see some stunting that's occurring because the maggots have turned to the root and are kind of chomping down on it. These do generally require a pretty high moisture content to be successful. They don't like to be in dry soil. So if you're watering more than you ought to be in a high tunnel, if you're over irrigating a little bit, or if things just aren't drying out, all of that can lead to really favorable habitat for fungus gnat maggots. I will point out that in the larval form, if you look at the left there, the kind of longer cream colored things are the maggots. The brownish tan colored thing is a pupa. You're probably never going to see the pupa. You might find other fly puparia kind of spread throughout production areas, but fungus gnats, when they pupate, it's typically in the soil, and so we don't usually see that. But occasionally you will see the maggots coming to the surface. They will sometimes crawl around in a group. One group of the fungus gnats that's pretty common in Kentucky, they will glom together in this kind of slippery, slimy mass. And when they do that, all of their bodies kind of congeal together and they will crawl, and it looks almost like a snake is moving. And they do that to try and protect themselves from potential predators. But it can also be very alarming to a high tunnel producer to walk in and see what seems like a mucus covered snake making its way through the tunnel. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Fungus gnat control really does start with moisture control. There's a lot of sanitation that we can do if we're providing sort of a mixture of high liquid content in the soil, high water, and then also if you're just sort of like continually mulching things down in there that are going to rot and decompose and maybe attract fungi to grow there, you will have a more sort of rich environment for the maggots to live in. So there's a couple of things that we can do to try and prevent that. You can open the tunnel up a little more. Sometimes you can aim a fan at sort of more problematic areas to try and dry it out. You can reduce irrigation. You can do irrigation from overhead rather than via the soil so that most of the moisture stays up on the plant. That can lead to disease problems, which you've probably learned about. And so there are pros and cons to each of these. There are other things that you can do to kind of test and see if you've got fungus gnats living in and around the tunnel. The easiest trick that I could give you would be to take a potato and then slice it up into about 15 or 16 pieces. So not super thick slices, but just big enough that it's kind of a meaty chunk of potato. You can put those potato discs on the surface of the soil and hot spots that you're concerned about. And as long as nothing else comes along and eats the potato, the next morning you can usually come and flip those over and you can find some of the fungus gnats. If you see a lot of them, if each slice has some, it might be time to think about doing something to try and mitigate that population. The adults can be controlled through contact insecticides. That's a bit of spray and pray, though. You are talking about typically releasing a fogger. Anything that would be labeled for greenhouses could be labeled for use in high tunnels here in Kentucky. And so there are options where it'll coat the entire inside with a pesticidal product that then when the flies land, it'll kill them. That's not something we necessarily advocate for because of the total release nature of it. You can put it on sort of hotspot areas too, sort of the wood and everything along the edge of the high tunnel where the adults may be landing. But then you have residues kind of out in the open that you or workers may be exposed to. So we want to get products maybe a little more germane to the situation where the maggots live. And the biggest option for that would be Natural, which is a BT product. You may have heard of BT for caterpillar control. That's a slightly different version of BT. This is a strain that is specific to Diptera, to fly larvae. And so when this is mixed up and applied to the soil, it will go down in there and it will infect, and the maggots will sort of ingest it and it will destroy their stomach lining and it will kill them. On the right, you're seeing some predatory nematodes that you can also purchase. You might probably are more familiar with nematodes as the root rot nematodes that are problematic, but there are also predatory and parasitic nematodes that we can actually weaponize and use against things like fungus gnats. You can find both of these kinds of products through the different sort of biocontrol clearinghouses. So Arbico, Rincon Ventova, a few other places will provide some of these, and you can purchase them for release. These are both organic, so I'm not trying to advocate exclusively for organic options, but in this case, those are actually some of our greatest weapons against the pest that we're trying to mitigate. The other things that we see kind of in sequence after the fungus gnats would be aphids. Aphids can be early risers in a high tunnel. They can show up pretty quickly in the growing season and start to create issues. There are several dozen species that we may encounter within the tunnel. Most of them will be green. They may be green with black edges, sort of black feet and black antenna. Some of them can be more of a pinkish green color. Some of them can be very, very dark green, almost black as well. Regardless of their coloration, aphids will present with some noticeable traits that separate them from other insects. They look like a jelly bean with legs, basically. They're kind of puffed up looking. They have almost see-through antenna. There's usually lots of them. They have a very distinct eye, typically. I think you can see that in both of these pictures, that the eye is noticeably different than the rest of the body. It looks harder and darker. But then the big things will be their needle-like mouth part, which you can see from the side while they feed, and then their cornicles. The cornicles are usually pretty obvious on most high tunnel aphid species. These are tailpipe-looking structures that are on the rear end of the aphid that they use to release pheromones and use mostly in defensive sort of systems. These are used to help protect themselves and other aphids in the kind of herd of aphids. Aphids do often come up in really large numbers. This is partially because they can reproduce through asexual means. Usually at the start of the year, you will find some winged aphids. Winged aphids are reproductive in a more traditional sense. There may be males and females mixed in with the winged aphids. So if you have sticky cards, which we'll talk more about here in a moment, you may see some aphids that have wings on there. After that, though, once they colonize an area, many of the males, they'll kind of dissipate, and then there will be just females left behind. And most populations we'll see during the summer are all female. These are mothers that are cloning themselves, giving birth to genetically identical daughters. You see a proud mama here in this little video who's giving birth, and then surrounded by all of her other daughters that are, again, genetically identical to her. And then they will rapidly develop, and then they will do the same thing. So you can kind of go from 0 to 60 with these kinds of aphids, and it happens very quickly. So aphids cause direct damage. They're also capable of transmitting various plant viruses as they feed because they're feeding on the sap of the plant. They can pick up bacteria and viruses from one plant, and if they end up moving to another nearby plant, they can vector those pathogens to the next plant. The most noticeable things with aphids are the bodies themselves, so seeing aphids, but then also seeing symptoms like their honeydew. Aphids are feeding on a sugary substance as they live and grow. When they're digesting it, they're passing a lot of sugar out as well. And so when they do this, we call it honeydew. Honeydew is very sticky. It's typically very shiny, and you'll notice it on a leaf. And then if you look at the leaf or leaves above that leaf, you will see that there are aphids there. You may also see it on pots if you've got those in the tunnel. If you're growing on benches, if you're in a greenhouse in particular, you'll sometimes see or feel it on the bench or any equipment that is below the plants themselves that can have the honeydew on it. Honeydew is pretty sticky. It's not like stickum or anything like that. It's not going to make you get stuck, but it does collect debris from the tunnel. Sometimes we'll find dirt and dust from inside the tunnel that has kind of been glued to the honeydew. But more importantly are the aphid exoskeletons. We have lots of aphids, and they're all growing and developing. As they do that, they shed their old exoskeleton. It may flutter down below and land in the honeydew, or there's just so many of them that we get kind of these piles of exoskeletons. They get stuck in the honeydew. It can give a plant a kind of dusky, dusty, gross look. And that is something that you can use to kind of know, okay, I need to go look at that plant and see what's going on. The other things that you may monitor for would be the deformed leaves that they produce. So not only the honeydew, but as they feed, leaves will typically cup and curl. They will look like they need water, and you'll also see sometimes some yellowing. So looking for that is something that will maybe give you a clue to go and inspect that plant further to see if you find more honeydew or see the aphids themselves. One of the best monitoring tools that you can use for aphids is a yellow sticky card. I got an image here from North Carolina State showing some of those winged reproductive aphids on the yellow sticky card trap, as well as a thrips. But these are easily deployed. They're usually easy to obtain. You can put these at the same height as the tomatoes. They need to go up with the tomato as it grows. So maybe on the wire or the rope, whatever it is that you've got above them. If you've got a bamboo pole or a plastic stake, anything that can make sure that you can move that trap up and down with the plant would be very good. That means that you're monitoring the most sort of susceptible area. They're easy to take down, and then they're easy to inspect. And then you can kind of try and figure out how many insects that you're dealing with. This will be a recurring theme with what I talk about here today, that we need these traps to know exactly what's going on in the high tunnel. The other thing I like to throw out with aphids is that I've been in many tunnels across the Commonwealth, and in a lot of them, we see a lot of encroachment of weeds. I know that herbicides are not something that are really available for high tunnel growers, but you do have a limited area with your high tunnel. You have something that is distinct and that you can kind of say, okay, I need to go in and I need to do some mechanical control here and make sure that weeds aren't within a foot or two of the overall structure, and especially not growing inside the structure. That's because weeds are these green bridges to the outside world. They help things like aphids to traverse from wild habitat to the more protected habitat that we're talking about in the tunnel. So you've got some Poa annua here, if I'm not mistaken, some annual bluegrass that's growing in this particular plasticulture area. And as we got closer to it, I realized that this plant was completely infested with aphids. There had been multiple applications of insecticides to the protected plants in this tunnel, but they kept getting reinfested as soon as the residue ran out. And that is because they weren't treating the weeds with anything. No herbicides, obviously, but then also no insecticides. So there was always this eager population of aphids kind of willing and waiting in a bank to leave from there and then go back out to the protected plants that didn't have an insecticide on them anymore. So as long as you kind of pull these up, mechanically destroy them, weed whack them, whatever it is that you want to do, you're cutting down on extra habitat that things like aphids need to thrive. We do have a pretty thriving biological control industry for these as well. They're very popular prey items for things like lady beetles and lacewings, and they're also a really important host for particularly parasitoid wasps. So there's lots of them usually, and that means that things like lady beetles and lacewings will get a lot of food out of them. Lady beetles in particular are known to eat about 5,000 aphids from their immature stages to adulthood. And then lacewings, they consume a similar number. They're also known as aphid lions because of their kind of way that they hunt. You can see a lady beetle in action there on the left, just chomping down on that aphid as if there's no tomorrow. The aphid seemingly saying, well, whatever, I wasn't enjoying life anyway, and allowing itself to be consumed. The lacewing on the right, it looks more like an alligator with saber-toothed teeth. They will eat scale insects and whiteflies and a few others, but they are also known to consume aphids with those sickle-shaped mandibles. We don't want to mess with these. They can pinch you as well, and it will actually burn quite a bit when they do that. So if you do release these, it's just something to be conscientious of. You don't want to mess with those horns in the front because they'll get you with them too. The wasps, on the other hand, are a little more nefarious. They're very tiny. These are stingless wasps. They're not going to harm you. They're not going to harm any of your workers. They are only interested in attacking aphids. So they will sting the aphid, typically towards the rear of the body. They may immobilize the aphid, but more commonly they just inject their egg into it, and then the baby wasp will develop inside. It will leave behind what's called an aphid mummy. That means these kind of puffed up aphids that you see on the right, which have been hollowed out and killed. You can have a thriving population of these, keeping the aphids in check. There'll probably still be aphids, but they won't be hindering plant growth. They won't be reaching the economic injury level. There are also numerous insecticides that can help with aphid problems. Contact products such as insecticidal soap or neem oil, these would be organic options. We do want to be careful with neem oil. You don't want to put it on the plant over 90 degrees usually. That limits its use and sort of efficacy in high tunnels, which can often be quite warm in the summer. But if you're talking about the start of the season or the end of the season, you may be able to get away with it. If you're willing to move up to insecticides that are synthetic, pyrethroids are very helpful. So bifenthrin, cyfluthrin, things of that nature. You can also make soil applications of neonicotinoids like imidacloprid, which are absorbed by the root zone of the tomato, and then they move that product throughout the whole plant. And as the aphids feed on that sap and suck it up, they will perish. The other things that can kind of pop up at the start of the season include some mites. Mites are often very difficult to control because they can proliferate quickly in a controlled setting, and they're also so small, they're very hard to detect. They're fluid feeding pests, just like the aphids. They feed on slightly different liquids, and they're also arachnids, so they're not insects. That further complicates things because we're typically using insecticides. The insecticides do not always have efficacy against arachnids, so sometimes we need to switch to a miticide, which we'll talk more about here in a moment. So some common species that you may encounter include the two-spotted spider mite, Lewis mite, broad mite, tomato russet mite, cyclamen mite. I'll focus on the broad mites first because these do occur with the cooler temps. So sort of at the start of the growing season, you may see damage like this. You're probably not going to see the culprits themselves. You'll see deformed buds. You will see sometimes if they're feeding on the plant, on the fruits, I should say, they will cause it to look more scarred, like you see in the image on the left. In terms of the damage to the buds and leaves, the buds will often sort of point downward as the broad mites get started. If they feed on that fruit, it becomes hardened and kind of brown and scarred. We have to use a microscope to confirm this, to actually see the mites themselves, but more specifically, their eggs. Their eggs are the more symptomatic part. So we'll zoom in here. You can see some mites, the kind of yellowy looking thing that we see here, that's slightly off-white. That's one of the mites. The rest of these are most likely eggs. The eggs almost look like they're bejeweled, bedazzled even. They have like these rows of almost sequin-like hexagons that we see. And that's what we would use to confirm that you're dealing with broad mites. This would be a mystery. You would not know what's happening. You would collect a sample, perhaps send it to the PDDL or to the Department of Entomology directly, and we would help you to sort of figure this one out. The same is true of russet mites. Russet mites have been observed on tomato in Kentucky. In other states, they've been seen on peppers and a few others, but here it's that tomato plant instead. They induce a kind of bronzed, greasy appearance on infested twigs, as we see on the left. Pardon my use of twigs. I am typically a tree entomologist. So kind of on the stems and on the lateral growth there, you'll see kind of this weird, greasy looking appearance. If they end up on growing fruits, they will cause them to russet, hence the name. This kind of rusty looking, crackled surface of the plant, of the fruit, rather than the healthy green one we see in the background. Other times we can see this developing, we have to do the microscopic identification as well. They look a little bit like a banana, which you can see here. They are a little different than what we see with spider mites. So spider mites, they attack over 300 species of plants. They can create lots of generations of themselves very quickly. They can complete development in as little as 8 days. Females lay around 100 eggs. They're found most often under leaves and around buds. They kind of prefer that tender, younger growth themselves. Many of the ones that we deal with in our samples have been two-spotted spider mites, which you see here. They are the ones that create webbing. You may have seen those words at the bottom of the screen earlier. I apologize for that. These are the ones that make webbing because they are spider mites. Spider mites produce silk similar to spiders, but they make it out of their face rather than the butt, which we see with spiders. The one thing that most people notice are these kind of weird clusters of webbing on an infested plant, but then also stippling. Mites, as they feed, they may induce this sort of staticky looking pattern on a leaf. They will do that by sucking juices out of very specific spots. You can look for web drop or leaf drop and then the distorted leaves as well. But all of that can usually add up to a spider mite problem. In terms of what we do with this, there is sanitation, so cleaning out infested plants and disposing of them, washing the area down to try and clean off any mites that may be left behind in a greenhouse in particular. If you had infested plants last fall and you just kind of like raked them down and pushed them to the side, there could be a lot of eggs in there. So pulling out all of the plant material at the end of the growing season is very helpful to reduce pest load for the start of the next year. We can plant trap plants, such as beans, in particular for spider mites, that can be near the plants that we actually want to protect. They'll get infested first, and if you're monitoring that, you can start to initiate control protocols. We can also perform biological control releases here. Usually we'd be using a predatory mite such as Amblyseius swerskii or Phytocelius persimilis, which you can see in action up here, attacking and consuming a two-spotted spider mite. These can be deployed relatively quickly at the start of noticing symptoms. If you know that you deal with these mites every year, you may even have an order kind of waiting for you every May so that you can begin to release these to keep mite populations in check. If you are going to turn to chemical control, it can be a little more difficult. We would be talking about miticides, such as things like Avid, Tetrasan, Pylon, Judo. I don't mention these to endorse specific trade names, just to sort of use them as representative systemic things that have translaminar properties that can work against most of the mite species that I've mentioned here. You always want to check the label to make sure that the mite and the tomato section is on there. What mites is it going to work against, and then is it able to be used on tomatoes? I'll round out some of our pest problems with thrips. Thrips are things that are very small. They are about 1/25th of an inch in length. They can develop through a whole generation again in about a week if they're given the right temperatures. There are multiple populations that we deal with, multiple species that we get: tobacco, western flower thrips, eastern flower thrips, depending on what you've grown in the tunnel before the tomatoes or after the tomatoes may impact which thrips you end up dealing with. Thrips is both the singular and plural, just to make that clear. That's why you'll hear me say a thrips and then the thrips. They are called thrips and then thysanurans because they have these really fringe-coated wings that you see here. Their wings are kind of hairy looking. They lay a lot of eggs. They lay 150 to 300 eggs down into the leaves. As they feed, they use a very strange set of mouth parts. They have asymmetrical mouths. Half of their mouth is slicing, so it's kind of cutting into the plant, and then the other half is sort of straw-like, it's tube-like, and it sucks the juices out of the wound that they have created. It creates distinctive flecking damage, which we see in the leaf, and then kind of the zoomed-in close-up. Then, as they go to the bathroom near their feeding site, they create distinctive black fecal material. It looks sort of like somebody's dipped a toothbrush in motor oil and then spritz that at the leaf that they're feeding on. This causes the leaves to deform. They may curl. Flowers may decay and kind of wilt and fall off. There's also a lot of silvery flecked scars in thrips infested plants. They're also capable of transmitting disease. Managing for thrips can start with preventing entry. So sanitation by checking plants that you're bringing in. If you have transplants that you're going to start with, make sure that you look and try and see if there are any thrips scars on those plants. And if they are infested, quarantine them and treat them before you put them in the ground. You can also avoid wearing certain colors of clothing. They like blue, white, and yellow. People who wear these colors often report getting thrips on them. Thrips will bite people as well. They're trying to figure out what your weird, squishy skin is. But if you have these colors on and you're kind of walking around in an infested area, you may end up getting thrips on you, and then you can bring them into the growing facility. So consider reds and purples and some other colors instead of these sort of standby classics. It's bad news for Morehead State fans, unfortunately. I think those are the three school colors right there. We can monitor for thrips specifically by using blue sticky cards. Those are better for catching thrips. They will also go to yellow, but if you want to specialize a little bit more, blue sticky cards are helpful for these. We can use biocontrol for them as well. There are predatory mites as well as predatory thrips. You can see a predatory thrips in the image on the left there, eating a pesty thrips. We can also spray a fungus called Bavaria bassiana, which will infest and mummify the thrips, as you see on the right. There are other options. These are some of the predatory mites. These are applied to consume smaller thrips. So if you know that you're going to deal with thrips, if it's been happening to you for a year or two, you might buy these at the start of the growing season, maybe in April, and you can release little sachets of Amblyosis swirsky, which I mentioned before, Hypoaspis miles. These were things that will hunt down thrips and kill them and eat them. They may not persist, particularly if they wipe out the thrips. They also succeed better if there's pollen for them to feed on. You can sometimes buy pollen to release for biocontrol agents. You can also sometimes just rely on them consuming pollen from the plants that you're growing. They can also be managed through several different types of insecticidal products. The biggest one is spinosad. It's the best option, even though it's organic. It's the best option for thrips. There's insecticidal soaps. There's also abamectin and bifenthrin that can be beneficial for thrips applications. Final pests I'll mention are whiteflies, another sucking pest that can stunt plants and vector viruses. They also produce honeydew, but different than aphids, they have a more scale-like insect appearance. They're flatter as immatures with sort of little hairs on their body. They're not as obviously legged and mobile. And then as adults, they're usually yellow with those kind of white wings that you see here, hence the name whitefly. The ones that we see most often are greenhouse and silverleaf whiteflies. There are some differences in how they hold their wings. Greenhouse whiteflies tend to hold their wings down and flat in a triangular shape. Silverleaf whiteflies hold their wings at an angle, and then there's a gap between the wings. For most people, it's sufficient to know that they're dealing with a whitefly problem. Again, sanitation here is important. If you've had an infestation, dispose of infested plant materials, clean things out so there's not eggs and other things sort of sitting around waiting to develop. You can have a fallow period if you've got multiple tunnels, but that's not most people. So I'm aware that that's probably not going to happen. That means that you'll want to monitor though. Put out yellow sticky cards to see if you catch the newly emerged mobile ones in the spring, or if you can catch adults that are starting to sort of fly around and look for other places to lay their eggs. You can also use things like Delphastus pusillus, which is a lady beetle-like insect that will go around and consume immature whiteflies. There are also wasps that will lay their eggs in them. In terms of insecticides, this is a table. I'll move that. Hopefully that video thing isn't quite in the way. There's Botanigard, which is Bavaria. There's a few different insecticides like imidacloprid, pyroproxyfen, diflubenzuron, all those things that can help to control whiteflies. This table, if you take a picture of it, also tells you what it may do to any biological control agents that you've used against the whiteflies. So with that, I appreciate the time and opportunity to be a part of this series. If you want to reach out to me, I am available. You can find my information on the Department of Entomology for University of Kentucky website. And I hope that the next class is a good one for you.